Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. I'm genuinely thrilled to have you here today because we're looking at something absolutely fascinating, a topic that bridges pop culture and true history in literally the most unsettling way imaginable. Today, we're uncovering the real faces behind the cinematic mask. Okay, let's dive into this, because the origins of the horror we watch on the silver screen, well, they're much closer to home and far more grounded in reality than you might think. Just let this sink in for a second. The fictional killers that have terrified you on screen for decades have real faces underneath the masks. Heavy, right? Once you truly understand the histories, the actual living, breathing people behind these characters, the horror movies you know and love will never ever feel quite the same again. Because our greatest on-screen fears aren't just shadows projected on a wall by a clever director, they are deeply rooted in cold, hard reality. And this brilliantly illustrates a really fundamental difference: the gap between monsters designed by a committee in a safe Hollywood writer's room and the ones discovered hiding in police reports. You know, the villains dreamed up by screenwriters are focus grouped and polished until they're scary, but ultimately they're safe. They aren't real. But the monsters discovered in reality, screenwriters didn't invent them. They found them. They found them lurking in court documents, in chilling crime scene photos, and in the breathless testimonies of the people who barely managed to survive them. To understand exactly how this works, travel back with me to November 1957. Picture a rural Wisconsin town called Plainfield. The air smells of livestock and cold soil. A hardware store owner named Bernice Warden is reported missing by her son. Hours later, police drive out to the edge of town to speak to a quiet, soft-spoken handyman who occasionally ran errands for folks. But when they push open the door to Ed Gein's farmhouse, everything accelerates. Moments later, the smell hits them first, something organic and just profoundly wrong. Seconds later, their flashlights sweep through the darkness and catch shapes hanging in the shed. What investigators found inside that quiet, isolated house honestly defies belief. Beyond a decapitated body dressed out like a deer, the nightmare just kept going. They found bowls fashioned from human skulls, a wastebasket constructed entirely from human skin, a lampshade made of human remains, and, maybe most disturbing of all, a vest shaped like a woman's torso, complete with breasts stitched together from the exhumed remains of at least 9 different women. Gein had been quietly digging up bodies from the local cemetery for years, operating completely undetected right under the town's nose. But what made Gein such a pivotal figure for writers wasn't just the sheer visceral gore of his crimes. It was his deeply fractured psychology. You see, Gein didn't actually see himself as a killer. In his disturbed mind, he thought of himself as someone simply trying to bring his dead mother back to life. Screenwriters saw a profound difference here. He wasn't purely evil in that traditional mustache-twirling sense, and he wasn't motivated by simple pleasure. He was a man motivated by grief that had twisted into a dark obsession. And writers love this, because an obsession born from grief is universally understandable, which makes the resulting monstrosity so much more terrifying. Now here's the detail that makes people go completely quiet. Ed Gein was considered so harmless for so long that his neighbors actually trusted him to look after their children. He was the local babysitter. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone's uncle. Just pause on that for a second. The uncanny valley reality that a man building furniture out of human remains was cheerfully trusted with the neighborhood kids. It's deeply unsettling. It completely shatters the illusion that evil always announces itself. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how, when you map Gein's police transcripts directly onto cinema history, the lineage is incredibly direct. Take Robert Bloch, the author who wrote Psycho. He lived just 40 miles away from Plainfield. He read the local newspaper reports and created Norman Bates, a shy, awkward, seemingly harmless man desperately keeping his dead mother alive in his head. Then, director Tobe Hooper pulled directly from Gein to create Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The isolated rural setting, the family using human remains as macabre decor, and that iconic, terrifying mask made of actual human skin, none of that was an artistic invention. It was literally pulled right from the police transcript. As we move from the 1950s into the mid-70s, the mask of the monster changes entirely. Ted Bundy looked absolutely nothing like what people expected a serial killer to look like, and he knew it. I mean, he was a law student, he was a volunteer at a suicide crisis hotline. He actively, intentionally used his normal, handsome, trustworthy appearance as camouflage to walk right up to his victims. He was the absolute master of weaponizing normal, using society's inherent trust against it. Bundy's methodology was chillingly calculated because he literally weaponized our own empathy against us. First, he presents that trustworthy, highly educated face. Then he stages false helplessness. He'd often wear a fake sling on his arm or maybe put a cast on his leg and openly struggle to carry books or groceries. He knew this would elicit natural kindness from strangers. Finally, he targeted his specific physical type, almost always young women with long dark hair parted down the middle. He essentially turned a victim's natural instinct to help into a lethal, inescapable trap. 30. That is the staggering confirmed gravity of his crimes. By the time Bundy was executed in 1989, the confirmed victim count was 30. But he was so meticulous and careful that investigators initially couldn't even connect his cases across state lines. He was caught twice, and incredibly, he escaped from custody twice. The second time, driving down to Florida to brutally murder 3 more people within weeks. So 30 is the confirmed number, but Bundy himself heavily implied in his final interviews that the real number was much, much higher. Let's move to and see how this builds the very foundation for modern slasher tropes. Think of a villain like Ghostface from the Scream franchise. The terrifying central idea of those movies is that the monster could be absolutely anyone. They rely heavily on social fluency to blend in. Well, that entire concept comes directly from Bundy's signature. Bundy passes perfectly in society. He doesn't look dangerous or deranged. He's just the charming guy who needs your help holding a door. That terrifying reality became the very skeleton of the modern slasher villain. Okay, we're going to step back even further now into the 1920s to a man named Albert Fish. In 1928, Fish committed an unspeakably horrific act, abducting a 10-year-old girl named Grace Budd from her home under the pretense of taking her to a birthday party. 6 years later, 6 years, in an act of pure monstrous cruelty, he sent her mother a letter detailing exactly what he had done to her child. It's a level of depravity that is almost impossible to wrap your head around. The man behind that abhorrent letter was a vicious predator who completely hid behind the gentle mask of a grandfather. He had children of his own, and he used that disarming age and appearance to his absolute advantage. Investigators eventually found that he had spent decades cowardly traveling the country, specifically targeting the most vulnerable people he could find: poor families, children with severe disabilities, people society wouldn't search too hard for. Psychiatrists evaluated him and found a constellation of disorders so complex they struggled to even categorize him. He felt absolutely no remorse, heard voices, felt called to do these things, and happily welcomed his own execution because he arrogantly believed there was nothing he couldn't endure. This terrifying psychological complex brings us to a masterpiece of modern cinema, The Silence of the Lambs. Author Thomas Harris didn't just invent these iconic characters out of thin air. He built brilliant, terrifying composites of the exact true histories we've just been discussing. Take Buffalo Bill, the killer who makes a skin suit. He's often credited solely to Ed Gein, but Harris confirmed the psychology was actually pulled from Albert Fish, as well as a man named Gary Heidnik, who infamously held women captive in a basement pit in Philadelphia. And Hannibal Lecter himself, he was built from a real, calm, brilliant doctor imprisoned in Mexico who Harris actually met while working as a journalist. So the crucial point is exactly how Harris built that character. Imagine being in his shoes for a second. When Thomas Harris sat across from that imprisoned Mexican doctor, he noted a deeply terrifying trait. The doctor was polite, conversational, and genuinely helpful in some ways, yet Harris couldn't look away from his eyes. As Harris put it, they were eyes that showed nothing human behind them. He lifted that unforgettable chill, that specific, visceral feeling straight from his own lived reality, and gave it directly to Hannibal Lecter. When we look back at the cinematic villains that truly last, the ones that stay with you long after the credits roll, the ones that make you double-check the locks on your doors, they endure because they are fundamentally anchored in truth. Fiction did not create these terrors. The mask of human skin, that was real. The skin suit was real. The charming man with his arm in a sling asking for help with his groceries was real. And the quiet, polite neighbor you trusted with your children was completely real. Fiction just found these details in police reports and held them up to the light for us to see. Which leaves us with a final thought to take away from this explainer. The next time a horror movie makes you feel like something is genuinely wrong, the next time a parking lot is just a little too quiet or a stranger is just a little too friendly, trust that feeling. If the fear feels like it's coming from somewhere deeper than a Hollywood screenplay, you might be exactly right about where it came from. Thank you so much for joining